Beyond the myth of exceptionalism, Ethiopia as an artificial imperial construct, the Berlin Conference, and the prison house of nations. Mainstream historiography has long propagated the myth of Ethiopia as an uncolonized, historically bounded African state that miraculously preserved its sovereignty during the European scramble for Africa. This paper challenges this Eurocentric and criminal Nafxania settlers' Abyssinian-centric narrative. It argues that Ethiopia, trademark in its modern iteration, has never functioned as a cohesive, voluntary nation-state. Rather, it is an artificial geopolitical construct of 14th century, plagiarized Northwest Asia myth from vacuum. She is one of the backward predatory settler colony, where the current population estimated to 139 million based on United Nations data, with more than 90 distinct ethno-nations in open prison house conquered, and occupied since the mid-19th century to the present. This structural reality was forged through the convergence of Abyssinian, 𝐿 territorial expansion, and European imperialism, specifically facilitated by the spheres of influence delineated during the Berlin Conference of Scramble for Africa-Rich Resources of 1884 to 1885. By examining the violent incorporation of the entire territories and free nations south to nominal Abyssinia proper, Oromia, Afar, Sidama, Somali, Kaffa, Walida, and other about 90 ethno-nations. Thus, this paper reframes modern Ethiopia not as a bastion of African freedom, but as the quintessential African colonial empire. 1. Deconstructing the myth of Ethiopian exceptionalism. The narrative of Ethiopian exceptionalism holds a privileged place in modern African historiography. According to this traditional view, Ethiopia stands as the sole African nation to successfully repel European colonialism, culminating in the victory at the Battle of Adwa on March 1, 1896. The triumphs is frequently analyzed through the romanticized lens of an isolated African civilization, miraculously overcoming European imperialism through sheer unity and spiritual fervor. This paper challenges this teleology by examining Adwa as a product of late 19th century European imperial rivalries, clandestine arms proliferation, and the cold calculus of military-industrial efficiency, long before Adwa. To understand the materiel at Adwa, one must first deconstruct the diplomatic landscape of the mid to late 19th century. Following the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, the Horn of Africa assumed critical strategic importance. Britain, France, and Italy vied for control over the Red Sea shipping lanes. Within this matrix, Menelik luckily emerged as a regional powerhouse in northern Tulama, Oromo Highlands around Goro Akobar, seeking to modernize his realm and consolidate his imperial ambitions against rival regional after the death of his masters, Tuidors in 1868 and Falwood by Yohannes in 1889. A jackpot for the underdog warlord from Ankober. He became the only candidate for greedy European powers to compete for the power to influences. To Rome, Menelik appeared as a pliable, ambitious provincial ruler who could be cultivated as a client king. Hence the condescending designation, ragazzo d'Italia, Italian boy or Italian guy, in translation, and the European scramble for influence. Italian strategists believed that financial subsidies, occasional shipments of obsolete weapons, and diplomatic flattery would secure Menelik's compliance with Italian colonial ambitions, culminating in the flawed Treaty of Wuchel, 1889. Rome's underestimated a sovereign utilizing inter-imperial competition Menelik. By tracing the flow of British, French, Russian, and even Italian munitions and military advisement into the Abyssinia highlands. It was the defeat of the proliferation of war machinery of European geopolitics and material reality. Thus, Adwa was not won by exceptionalism, while exceptionalism does not exist at all, let alone in a battle failed, but by the fundamental axiom of military history. Victory on the battlefield belongs to the more efficient, better supplied war machine. Advised by his Thrutst Habsonid Swiss Alfred Ill, functioned as a sub-imperial collaborator with European colonial powers, simultaneously successfully resisted direct European flags of occupation. In doing so, the Abyssinian state violently colonized, subjugated, and annexed neighboring indigenous nations, quadrupled its geographic size in the late 19th century, precisely during the height of the European scramble for Africa. This paper posits that modern Ethiopia is not a state in the Westphalian sense, a political entity representing a unified sovereign citizenry, but an artificial imperial construct. But it is an open prison house where drawn, negotiated, and legitimized through the geopolitical machinations of the European powers at the Berlin Conference of 1884–1885 and subsequent bilateral colonial treaties. 2. The Berlin Conference of Scramble for Africa and the Cartography of Subjugation. The Berlin Conference, Berlin West Africa Conference, convened from November 1884 to February 1885 under the stewardship of Otto von Bismarck. Its primary objective was to regulate European colonization and trade in Africa by agreeing on administrative boundaries and spheres of influence and to aviad bloodbath within themselves. While European powers partitioned the continent, the Abyssinian warlords emerged in T-region were recognized as shareholders, not victims, an unprecedented opportunity. Rather than viewing European powers solely as existential threats, they perceived them as suppliers of modern weaponry and arbiters of international recognition. In exchange for formal diplomatic recognition and modern firearms, they were actively aligned their expansionist ambitions with the cartographic partitioning dictated by Great Britain, France, and Italy, and Menelik was turned to be the only beneficiary fro all Euroans while bought is Master Tuadros in 1868, and Iohannis in 1889 were killed. The mechanics of spheres of influence. The General Act of the Berlin Conference established the doctrine of effective occupation. European powers could not merely claim territory, they had to demonstrate control. For the Horn of Africa, European powers relied on Menelik's Abyssinian army, and conglomerates of disfranchised Iohannis Armwo joined him, to act as their proxy in the interior, effectively subduing the autonomous nations of the southern, eastern, and western lowlands and highlands. The Anglo-Ethiopian Treaty of 1897. Following the Battle of Adwa, Britain recognized Menelik's expanded borders in exchange for a joint demarcation of the border between Ethiopia and British Somaliland, and later Kenya and Sudan. Franco-Ethiopian and Italo-Ethiopian Accords. France secured the Addis Ababa, Djibouti railway concession, ensuring its economic sphere of influence, while Italy carved out its presence in Eritrea and Italian Somaliland, implicitly and explicitly negotiating borders with Menelik's expanding empire. Thus, the borders of modern Ethiopia were not born of indigenous consensus or a natural organic evolution of a state, but were drawn at the intersection of European imperial rivalry and Abyssinian territorial greed in over dozens of treaties. 3. The making of the prison house, internal colonialism and conquering the South. Prior to the last quarter of the 19th century, Abyssinia, historically comprising the northern highlands of Tigray, Amhara, and parts of Eritrea, was a fragmented region characterized by shifting feudal realms. The radical transformation of Abyssinia into Ethiopia occurred through a brutal campaign of military conquest led by T warlord called Menelik, an offspring of rape, a chronic patient of syphilis, who cannot read and write his own language, died of neurosyphilis without biological offspring between the 1865 and 1913. The Oromo and other nations under siege. The largest of the colonized nations of the entire South, the Oromos, along with the Afar, Sidama, Kaffa, Walida, Gambella, the Somalis of the Ogaden, etc., possessed decentralized, democratic, or well-established independent socio-political systems, such as the Oromo-Gada system. The military campaigns waged by Menelik's generals, such as Ras Gobna, were characterized by extreme violence. Historical records, including contemporary accounts and indigenous oral traditions, document mass atrocities, including the amputation of hands, mass enslavement, the imposition of oppressive feudal land tenure systems, GULT, and cultural eradication. Demographic devastation. Scholars estimate that the conquest of the southern nations resulted in the demographic decimation of up to 50% of the indigenous populations due to warfare, engineered famine, and smallpox introduced from the north. The 𝐏𝐫𝐢𝐬𝐬 system. To administer the newly acquired territories, the imperial state instituted the 𝐏𝐫𝐢𝐬𝐬 gun-bearer settler system. Indigenous peoples were reduced to gabars, serfs, on their own ancestral lands, forced to pay heavy tributes and labor for northern military settlers who confiscated their fertile agricultural lands. 4. Structural hegemony and the denial of self-determination. For over a century, the Ethiopian imperial state, whether under the absolutist rule of Emperor Haile Selassie, the military dictatorship of the Derg, Mengistu Haile Mariam, or the subsequent regimes, has maintained a strict policy of cultural, linguistic, and political homogenization. Cultural and linguistic erasure. The imperial ideology was built on the pillars of one language, one religion, and one culture. Amharization. Indigenous languages of the entire colonized people that belongs to 𝐏𝐫𝐢𝐬𝐬 family, such as Afan Oromo, Somali, Sidama, and Walata, etc., 𝐏𝐻𝐫𝐢𝐬𝐬 and Nilotic families were banned from administration, education, and the judiciary. Amharic was imposed as the sole national language. Religious subjugation. Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity, more precisely the vulgar version of imported and plagiarized Byzantine version, was declared the state religion, while indigenous belief systems and Islam, particularly prevalent among the Oromo, Afar, and Somali nations and others, were systematically marginalized or persecuted. The illusion of federalism. Following the overthrow of the Derg in 1991, the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, EPRDF, introduced a constitution in 1995 that established ethnic federalism, the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia. Article 39 of the Constitution formally granted nations, nationalities, and peoples the right to self-determination, up to secession. However, critics and political scientists have long noted that this was a facade. Real power remained concentrated in the hands of a centralized political elite. Ethnic federalism was utilized not to empower the 90-plus nations, but as a tool of divide-and-rule administration, mapping artificial regional boundaries that exacerbated inter-ethnic conflicts while preserving the overarching centralized state apparatus. When nations attempted to exercise their constitutional rights, such as demands for genuine autonomy or secession, they faced severe state repression, military intervention, and mass incarceration. 5. Contemporary realities, an open prison house in crisis. Today, Ethiopia's population exceeds 139 million, comprising a vast mosaic of nations structurally locked within a geopolitical cage designed in the late 19th century. The structural violence embedded in the empire's founding continues to manifest in severe political instability, civil wars, and humanitarian crises. State-sponsored violence. Recent conflicts within the empire, such as in Tigray, Amhara, Oromia, Ogaden, the Benishangul-Gumuz, Gambell, and the southern nations, demonstrate the fragility of a state held together solely by military coercion rather than a voluntary social contract. Displacement and land grabs. Pastoralist and agrarian nations, such as the Anuak, Gumuz, and Oromo, continue to face systemic displacement through state-backed land grabs, where ancestral lands are leased to foreign agro-corporations and domestic elites. The crisis of legitimacy. The recurring cycle of civil war underscores that the Ethiopian state lacks a foundational consensus. Without addressing the historic injustices of the 1884–1900 imperial conquests, peace remains unattainable. Modern Ethiopia is a historical anomaly, a 19th-century Euro-dependent African empire that survived the collapse of classical European colonialism by adopting its methods. Born out of the geopolitical partitioning of the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, Abyssinia, contemporary trade name Ethiopia, was never a voluntary union of free peoples. Instead, it was forged through the subjugation of over 90 distinct ethno-nations by an Abyssinian warlords acting in concert with European imperial interests, ta enailed to establish, maintain the predatory settler colonial empire in the Horn of Africa. To view Ethiopia as a unified, ancient state is to perpetuate a myth that silences the millions of colonized voices trapped within its borders. Indeed, she excites on pieces of paper, and in the crocodile's mind of the recitals of the offsprings of Neftegnas. Until the foundational question of self-determination is genuinely addressed, Ethiopia will remain what it has always been since its modern inception: an open prison house of nations marching toward inevitable dissolution or radical democratic transformation. Thank you for watching. Your support means the world. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, spread the message to new friends. Subscribe and leave a comment below to join the conversation.